Welcome to another edition of Radio Influencers, a podcast series we're doing for Radio Update. I'm your host, Andy Meadows. So something we've been writing about and talking about a lot at Radio Update. Tracy Johnson wrote an article about it, and so did Stephanie Blue as well. Nielsen is changing the definition of a quarter hour of radio listening in PPM markets from a minimum of 5 minutes of listening to 3. They've been testing and comparing how the changes will affect ratings reports, but haven't announced the date it will be reflected in PPM market reports, or whether this will eventually lead to the same change in diary markets. Obviously, this is going to increase the AQH, average quarter hour, for all stations, but it will have an even bigger impact on certain formats that are high AQH and lower TSL like CHR, Hot AC, Country, etc. But while this looks good on paper, isn't it really just patching a broken and outdated system and in the process making radio ratings even less accurate? Don't get me wrong, I still encourage every radio client to subscribe to Nielsen if they can afford it and it helps them sell in their specific circumstances and if Nielsen hasn't already dropped their market. But for years now, I've been thinking and writing about how we've got to be on the cusp of someone creating a better system for accurately measuring terrestrial radio listening. Since we can already measure streaming and all of our digital stats ourselves much more accurately, exactly. With all the recent massive advancements in technology, to be honest with you, it should already be here. But until someone does invent a better mousetrap, there are a few things radio stations can already do to get better, more accurate audience estimates. So on today's episode, we'll run through a few of those. Hope you like it. RadioPlayer and DTS Autostage. As I've mentioned before, car dashes are changing dramatically, especially in the next few years. Here are a few examples of what car dashes will look like in the near future. Do you see how many screens there are? The whole dash, and eventually even the windows, will become screens as autonomous cars become more mainstream and affordable. Terrestrial radio is still very dominant in cars. If we want that to continue, we're going to have to work on how we look on those screens. There are two companies that are trying to get ahead of that with slightly different approaches. DTS Autostage is already here in the U.S. and has deals with some of the automakers. It's a free service to radio because essentially they work on behalf of the car companies. So while they will share some of the top-line data with radio, they share all of it with the car companies, which makes sense because they're the ones footing the bill, not radio. Their hurdle is to get radio stations to sign up at scale, and they've already gotten some to do that, as I understand. RadioPlayer is a European-based company that's funded by European broadcasters, and for years they've successfully done the same things in Europe. Because our data here in the U.S. is so vital to them, they're also willing to provide their services free of charge to radio. And here's the kicker, they will give us all the data. However, they need both radio to sign up at scale and more of the key automakers to make it work. There are massive benefits to radio with both of these companies, with what both of these companies are doing. Seamlessly transitioning from terrestrial to streaming when you drive out of the coverage area. That's a huge thing for rimshot stations or any station that doesn't cover, 100% of a market. Displaying now playing data or upcoming songs, teases to contest or content. Imagine being able to display, hey, you're 7 minutes away from your next chance to win tickets to see, insert major artist name here. Really anything that we can send that we send them the metadata for, they could display on these screens. I'm asking representatives from both companies, by the way, to come on a future episode of the podcast so they can go into it in more detail, but it's some really exciting stuff. Audio fingerprint technology. A few years ago at TAB, a friend of mine and fellow radio nerd who isn't offended when I introduce him that way, Curtis Mawchek, said something to me at dinner that stuck with me for years. Curtis is, by the way, the owner of TextGroove, a really cool texting platform for radio that lets you use your existing request number and opens up a lot of great options and opportunities for texting contests and listener engagement. It's a really cool tool. We were all sitting around talking about our issues with how audience is measured in radio, and he held up his phone and said, "Why hasn't someone figured out how to do it on an app?" Which led to a lively discussion about why that would be hard to do, and the system we have isn't perfect, but it's the one we got type comments with everyone kind of shooting holes in it. But again, this was a few years ago, and the technology now is already here. If radio would band together, starting with a few of the big groups and then a handful of the independent groups, a smartphone app could be created today that would use audio fingerprint technology to accurately measure exactly what anyone with a phone who downloads the app, which we could pay them a small amount a month for, and give them some other perks to get massive amounts of people to do it, we could actually accurately measure what a much larger sample base of listeners are tuning into in real time. There are some really smart people who can explain this better than I can. I've asked one of them to come on the podcast soon, and hopefully they'll take me up on it. The challenge is people are reluctant to talk about this kind of stuff because A, they don't want anyone stealing their idea, obviously, and making tons of money off of it. And B, there's an underlying sentiment that radio doesn't really want to know exactly how many people are listening because it's less than we think it is. In my opinion, based off conversations I have with people on and off the record, that is not true. Radio would rather have accurate measurements that they can actually trust, and as many or more people are listening to terrestrial radio than we think. Radio research companies. The panel I moderated at NAB last week was all about research. The title was Leveraging Data Insights to Improve Programming, Promotions, and Bottom Lines. I had an all-star list of panelists: Rhyme Media CEO Dan Bobkoff on the podcast side, Radio 1 and Research Media Senior VP of Programming Colby Tyner, and a couple of research experts, Coleman Insights Media Research VP Jay Naklis, and Edison Research's Director of Research, Laura Ivey. One of the first questions I asked Laura was something I hear from a lot of people. With so much easily accessible data seemingly everywhere online, why do I have to pay for research in 2024? Her answer was essentially that not all data is created equally, and then she went on to explain that. What we have to remember is the data we see for free on the internet is just the surface, the tip of the iceberg. Similar to the DTS and RadioPlayer situation I just mentioned, it's important to remember that whoever is paying for the data is the one who's seeing the whole picture. Plus, there's a big difference between someone who's new to looking at data and someone who's spent their whole career learning how to interpret data. I still think there's a huge value in radio groups paying companies to do research specifically on their behalf that's customized to their markets, formats, target demos, target advertisers. These are two of the companies I'd recommend for that: Coleman Insights, Sam Milkman, Jay Naklis, and Scott Musgrave, and Edison Research. I highly recommend either of those companies. A few more to include would be Mark Greenspan at Research Director, who will be joining me on an upcoming episode of this podcast to talk about research. And my pal Mike Shepard also does fantastic research on the programming side. By the way, I videoed the NAB session, and I'll put it out on my consulting website, radiostationconsultant.com, later this week, early next week at the latest. Create your own audience estimates. When I consult a station, every big book promotion we suggest is specifically built to do two things: increase listenership and collect tons of data. Pair a big prize, cash or trips that are actually winnable at a local or at least a regional level with listening appointments and an easy way to enter their information. People will absolutely still give you their info for a legit shot at winning a prize they want. The bigger the prize, obviously, the more info they'll give you. You can also get a percentage of them to give you even more info with additional incentives or secret contest, contest within a contest, or follow-up contest. Pairing all of that data and information with everything we can already track on the digital side, streaming sessions, website page views, social impressions and engagement, app downloads and engagement, calls into the studio if you're using VoIP lines, along with whatever you can collect at on-site events, will give any station the ability to create some of their own audience estimates with better psychographics than they could ever get from Nielsen. Again, I'm not suggesting for anyone to drop Nielsen, but we should all keep an eye out for what's coming and look into everything that's currently available to help us collect research and data that helps our stations tell their story to potential advertisers. What do you think? Email me your thoughts, or better yet, record them, audio or video, and send them to me at andy@radiostationconsultant.com, and we'll try to include some of them in an upcoming episode. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Radio Influencers. Radio Influencers is a radio update production. New episodes are released on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern.